Within minutes, the instruments showed they were above Park City, but everything felt strange. They couldn't see a thing, other than the faint outline of Mount Timpanogos to the right. "I feel we're too low," Mike said. "The instruments seem wrong." Just then they saw a campfire on a hill above them. "Whoa, we're in trouble," Mike said. "Trust in the Lord," Nathan said. "Take your hands off the controls." "No way," Mike said. "Are you nuts? Do it or we're going to die." Mike closed his eyes and lifted his hands. Hello, and welcome to Wordwise. I'm your host, Kit, and today we'll be discussing Chad Daybell's 12th novel, Days of Fury. This is the third book in his final series, Times of Turmoil. I know this video is probably a bit later than expected. I was trying to upload weekly, and it was just too much for me. I started doing things like showing up to my dentist's appointment a week early and forgetting to use self-rising flour in the soda bread. These sorts of things are an indicator that I'm pushing too hard, and if I don't back off, I will inevitably get sick. So I'm slowing down a bit. I'm also taking a film class at my local community college, go Triceratops, so that I can improve the quality of these videos in the long run. Without further ado, let's take a look at Days of Fury. Chad uses the author's note to claim that the reason 2 years passed between the publication of Martial Law and Days of Fury is that the spirit told him to wait. He says he met Julie Rowe soon after, and that everybody should read her books, and also Hector Souza's. He never explains how Julie Rowe coming into his life delayed the writing. Maybe he was just busy. Before the story begins, there's a section titled, "The Enemy Approaches," which is 3/4 summary of the state of affairs at the end of last book, and 1/4 hints about things that are going to happen in this book. The whole section is unnecessary. Chapter 1. Grant Foster, a lapsed Mormon who ended the last book by pledging his loyalty to the Coalition, is in Nevada with the evil UN forces led by General Klopoff. Only a few days ago, Russia and the Middle East cut off all oil shipments to the US, and everybody's taking it in stride. Just kidding. Society has collapsed into violence and chaos. The UN forces head out of town, blowing away civilians as they go, on their way to Salt Lake. General Klopoff has been ordered to secure the NSA data center near Salt Lake, but as we learned in the last book, the UN has no maps. So when they learn that I-15 is blocked, they have to rely on Garrett's memory of the roads to find a workaround. That's why Garrett is so valuable to the UN. The next day, they're passing through St. George when Garrett looked for the St. George Temple because he was afraid the building would attract Klopoff's attention. However, it wasn't where it was supposed to be. All he saw was shimmering red rock hills in the distance. The temple should have been clearly visible on the right side of the freeway. He couldn't understand how that magnificent white edifice had disappeared. Garrett took one more look to the right, and this time, to his surprise, he could see the temple standing prominently in the center of the city. After a few seconds, it vanished again. His heart burned within him that God had created a mirage to hide the temple from the UN convoy. "I really am on the wrong team," he muttered. Of course, Garrett doesn't actually do anything about being on the wrong team. He just keeps popping off starving, panicked civilians. Thus ends Chapter 1. When we last saw Aaron Shaw, he had quit his job at the NSA, cut the chip out of his hand, and was wandering the Salt Lake suburbs, using the power of the priesthood to save people and dry out flooded basements. He and the general authority with him, Elder Bushman, break into the Salt Lake LDS Conference Center and brave underground tunnels full of waist-high water to make it to the temple, where they meet Elder Smith. Elder Smith is the one character from the Standing in Holy Places series that Chad decided should cross over to this series. I don't know why, because anybody with the title Elder in this story is exactly the same character. Elder Bushman, Elder Miller, Elder Smith. It doesn't matter, except that Elder Smith's wife is missing. Thus ends Chapter 2. We catch up with Mormon maintenance missionary and budding action hero Nathan Foster and his new wife Marie, who's been humbled and given up her dreams of a career in public relations. With them are Marie's mother, Carol, and Nathan's 12-year-old sister, Denise. At the end of the last book, these four were reunited at the crappy blue camp in Walsburg, where Carol and Denise encouraged everyone to pray for a miracle before their food stores ran out. Looks like they booked it out of there shortly after the prayer, and they've been walking for 5 days in order to reach one of the much nicer white camps, which likely still has food. I guess God helps those who help themselves. Here's a map of the area. I tried to show that the earthquake had caused the Jordanelle Reservoir to overflow and wipe out Heber, which I assume is now just a big mudflat. They've walked from Walsburg, here, through the foothills, to approximately here, because they're trying to get to the white camp near Camas. Carol, however, is apparently unable to make it. I'm not really sure why. Most Mormons are married quite young, and Marie is a college student, so I think it's unlikely that Carol is older than 50, but she can barely walk. We don't know why. Chad is beginning to get sloppy with his plotting in other ways, too. Regarding Nathan, he had invited other members of the Walsburg camp to join them, but there hadn't been any takers. They were content to stay there for the time being. The people at the Walsburg camp were less than 2 weeks from running out of food, but they decided to stay there instead of joining the camp that had plenty of food? What's wrong with these people? Are they nuts, or did Chad just not want to deal with Nathan having to lead a couple hundred people to Camas? I'm not even sure the people at the Camas camp would let them in. The Walsburg camp was second tier, so none of the people there were sufficiently obedient to deserve food. I think Chad included this because he didn't want his readers to think Nathan had abandoned these people, but this is worse. It would have been much more interesting if the members of the camp had turned on Nathan and friends and kicked them out, and then Chad could have emphasized how God had lost interest in those people for a reason. I'm actually surprised that the Camas camp is going to let Denise in, given that she's a Catholic. But don't worry, Chad's going to take care of that. The hike had actually been very beneficial for Denise, both physically and spiritually. She had been raised in the Catholic faith by her mother Vanessa, but ever since Nathan had come into her life, she had been very intrigued by the teachings of Mormonism. When they first started hiking, she had fired off several questions. Finally, Nathan took the initiative and essentially taught her the missionary discussions as they walked along. Denise had absorbed it all. As usual, any good character has to convert. I want to remind you before I read this that Denise is supposed to be 12. I know what you were teaching me is true, she said on the 3rd day. I want to become a member of the church. How can I join? You must be baptized, Nathan had told her, but it needs to be done in the proper way. We need to reach a camp and have an authorized priesthood leader interview you and approve it. I can't wait, Denise had responded. Why not? She's going to make it to the camp in a couple of days. She can't wait 72 hours? I'm not clear on why Nathan doesn't just baptize her in a creek along the way, but I suspect Nathan isn't spiritually qualified to do the interview. You might have to be a high priest to do that. I'm not really sure. Anyway, Chad just changes the subject without resolving it. The group decides to split up because Carol's too weak to continue. The women rest while Nathan goes ahead to see how much farther the Heber Valley camp is. I didn't realize there was a Heber Valley camp the first 2 times I read this. That means there are camps every 10 to 12 miles. Is it just me, or does that seem like an outrageous number of camps? What happened to hiding deep within the mountains? They stop to rest, and Carol just passes out on the ground next to an anthill. Nathan hikes ahead and is met by a guy on a 4-wheeler who's a guard at the Heber Valley camp. They introduce themselves. The guard's name is Paul. He pulled out a gadget the size of an iPhone and touched a few buttons on the screen. Nathan gave him a curious look. I'm guessing you're not trying to connect with Verizon or Sprint. Paul grinned. Nope. This is the church's own network that we got running a few weeks ago. This way we aren't dependent on anybody else. I doubt the government even knows it exists. I'm not sure why they waited until after the world fell apart to set this network up. Paul explains that the network connects to the church's online database. It lists everyone who is at one of the church's white camps. We can send messages to each other and verify if people are really who they claim to be. You said your name is Nathan Foster? Yep. Paul typed in a few words, then said, You served a mission in Minnesota, and you're a maintenance missionary based out of the bishop's central storehouse. Yes, that would be me. This isn't how you verify someone's identity. If Nathan wasn't who he said he was, Paul just fed him all the information he needs to fake it. Then Paul says that the church's network has access to the NSA's data, and he verifies the identities of Carol, Marie, and Denise. They go to the camp, get some four-wheelers, and go back and retrieve the women. Everybody rides to the Heber Valley camp. Carol was pleasantly surprised at the difference between the Wallsburg camp and this camp. There were plenty of smiles among the members, and the camp was well maintained and clean. No one seemed to be hungry, and she could tangibly feel the Spirit of the Lord surrounding them. You'll be safe here, Elder Clough told her. I know, Carol said. I've missed this feeling. I just have to point out yet another failure to describe a setting. Chad says people are smiling and no one seems to be hungry, which, unless they're literally starving, I don't think you can see. And the camp is well maintained and clean, but he doesn't tell us how many people are there, if they're living in tents or cabins, what people are doing. Instead of simply stating that this camp is different from the Wallsburg camp, he could have provided examples. But he didn't. Thus ends chapter 3. Aaron is hanging out in the temple with Elder Smith, who's worried because he hasn't heard from his wife since before the earthquake. They talk about how the prophet knew the earthquake was coming, but he didn't know quite when it would hit, and Aaron demonstrates actual critical thinking for a moment. If you knew this earthquake was coming, how come the prophet didn't tell us about it? I just spent a week crossing this valley, and I saw unbelievable problems. Many of those issues could have been averted if the prophet had just been more direct when he issued the invitation to gather. Elder Smith had heard this argument before, and he understood what Aaron was saying, but it was time for some clarification on the matter. Honestly, Elder Smith's explanation makes zero sense to me. I think Gosha understood it when I read it to him, but even after he explained it to me, I still didn't understand it. I might have just been raised with such a different framework that I can't follow this logic. But essentially what Elder Smith says is that the prophet warned people over and over to be ready to bolt to the mountains, but he couldn't outright tell people an earthquake was coming because, as Aaron puts it, such a statement would make the members fully accountable for how they responded to the prophet's words. Correct, Elder Smith said. The Savior chooses to be more merciful. How is God not holding people accountable in this situation? I mean, everyone who didn't gather to the mountains ended up dead or miserable or starving in a blue camp, so... The ones who stayed behind have suffered the effects of their choices, Elder Smith said. This is all part of our learning process here on Earth. It hasn't been easy for any of us. Just trust that the Lord is in charge, and he will be more merciful to all of us than we can imagine. I'm so confused. Is Jesus holding them accountable or not? Or is this part of people getting humbled? And why do people have to get humbled again? The whole thing is just confusing to me, and it characterizes Jesus as strangely manipulative in a way that I, at least, never heard about him acting when I was in church. And Chad seems to be waffling back and forth between God having abandoned everyone who didn't gather to the mountains and God making disobedient people miserable so they'll worship him. Which sounds more like coercive control than love to me, but as I said, I'm not a Christian. And I'm not convinced that Chad is a Christian. Claiming you're so spiritually elevated that you no longer need Christ's atonement and can do whatever you want doesn't sound super Christian to me. In summary, this whole conversation is bewildering, and uses twisted theological arguments to justify the prophet not warning everyone that an earthquake was coming. Then Elder Smith feels compelled to take Aaron up to the roof and show him all the devastation in the area. For a guy who doesn't like to write scene descriptions, Chad sure loves these panoramic descriptions of destruction. Aaron almost felt dizzy as he took in the panoramic view of the downtown area. He looked to the northwest where the apostle had pointed, and the flooding seemed to stretch endlessly. Aaron could see Antelope Island in the distance, and there wasn't a break in the water between the island and the temple, other than buildings and freeway overpasses jutting out of the water. What a terrible sentence. Elder Smith says it's time for the church to move its headquarters out of Salt Lake, and wants Aaron to guess where they're going. Think about it, though. Is there anywhere we've devoted a lot of money and effort for such a seemingly remote place? Aaron raised his eyebrows. BYU, Idaho? Bingo, Elder Smith said. I know Chad is very proud of having attended BYU, but I have a hard time believing Aaron would correctly guess this. Also, why would the church move its headquarters 250 miles farther from Missouri if they know they're going to go there soon? Elder Smith says that the church is already in the process of moving its headquarters to Rexburg, which was, of course, the place Chad had just moved to. I'd say that was him wanting to incorporate real-life places he had visited into his novel, but I actually think it was the opposite. He gave Rexburg this role in his novel because he wanted his readers to believe it was an important, holy place. Then he used that belief to convince people to follow him there so that he could build his cult. These books, and especially, I think, his postings on Avow, were sort of marketing for his cult. Naturally, because this plot point makes no sense, Chad immediately has his characters reassure each other that it makes sense. Wow, I hadn't even considered that before, but it makes perfect sense, Aaron said. Plus, it gets so cold there in the winter that our enemies will stay away. This killed me. Their enemies are Russia and China. I don't know much about China, but given how large it is, I assume parts of it get quite cold. As for Russia, though, we're talking about a country that uses its cold climate as a weapon. How did it fight off Napoleon? Winter. How did it fight off Wee Moustache? Winter. And Chad knows that Russia is cold. He wrote that whole plotline in Standing in Holy Places about how the lost 10 tribes of Israel were living in Siberia and had to hike hundreds of miles through the snow. I can't believe he really thought that the cold in Rexburg would dissuade the coalition. Thus ends chapter 4. The next chapter is primarily concerned with another version of that scene Chad loves to write where everyone gathers around and listens to someone describe their experiences. I think that Chad just loves being the center of attention, so he assumes that his characters love it too, because this scene keeps popping up in different iterations. It's interesting because I think it's supposed to be a version of giving testimony, which is supposed to be centered around Jesus, but Chad's descriptions are always just the character talking about themselves and then throwing in a little Jesus here and there. In this version, Nathan, Marie, Carol, and Denise all stand up in front of everyone at the Heber Valley camp and describe everything that's happened to them since the call out. Nathan begins by commending everyone there for being right and crapping on everyone who didn't gather in the mountains. Hello, my name is Nathan Foster, and I commend you for following the prophet, he said. I've been serving as a church maintenance missionary since the spring, and I observed a sifting among the saints even before the prophet's invitation. People who were active members of the church just a few months ago are now dead because they chose to disregard the prophet's counsel. Other members are in the so-called blue camps, and their lives aren't pleasant. Earlier this week, we were in the camp in Walsburg, and they are nearly out of food. Many of them are contemplating going back into Utah Valley, which would be a terrible decision. But they still didn't want to go with you. I'm just perplexed by why he would say all of this, other than because he's a giant tool. I'm also befuddled by this bit. The so-called blue camps. Blue was just a designation to distinguish them from the white camps. In what way are they not really blue? I think Chad wrote this because he associated so-called with insults, but he didn't stop to think about the actual meaning of the phrase. Calling those camps blue isn't giving them a compliment they don't deserve. Nathan and Marie talk about Chicago and the Grape Death and Nauvoo, and Carol talks about how Aaron worked at the NSA. My biggest issue with this scene is I don't understand why Chad wastes these pages rehashing everything that's happened. Even if it were necessary for plot reasons that the entire Heber Valley camp know all of this, the reader doesn't need to go through it again. It could all have been summarized in a paragraph. Somebody in the comments brought up showing versus telling, and that's one of Chad's biggest weaknesses. He doesn't know when to show and when to tell, and this book is full of examples of that. During her turn to speak, Carol says this. Things finally got so bad in Orem that I was in constant fear that someone was going to break into our home. I just didn't feel safe anymore. Actually, Carol and Aaron decided it was time for her and Denise to leave because martial law had been enacted. There was never any mention of crime in Orem until after they'd already left. I don't know if Chad forgot that, or I don't know what happened here. During her turn to speak, Denise turns to Elder Clough, who's in charge, and asks him to baptize her before sundown. All I can figure is that she's scared she'll die at any moment. Or maybe she's got a second personality that's evil, and she needs to get some Jesus before it bursts out. Elder Clough is all for an impromptu baptism, so they dig out some white clothing and hike to a nearby freezing cold lake, and Denise is baptized and then confirmed by Nathan. Nathan, however, is worried about a message he got back in Nauvoo, which was that all maintenance missionaries were supposed to return to Elder Miller's storehouse in Salt Lake, which is probably now in the giant hole in the middle of the city. Elder Clough tells him to leave his family at the camp and go, but Marie insists on going with him. Nathan rolled his eyes at his spunky wife, but inwardly he was thrilled. It would be dangerous for both of them, but it felt right. Thus ends Chapter 5. Chapter 6 begins with the UN convoy driving through empty towns in Utah. Americans once lived in these towns, correct? Commander Klopoff asked Garrett. No, they were built by bears. 30% of Utahns are bears. Klopoff casually reveals that the U.S. government has compiled and shared a list of troublemakers. They are mostly religious fanatics or people who are suspected of fleeing to the mountains. That's very interesting, Garrett said. Is the government actively searching for these people? I think they are, but they are shifting the responsibility to us now, Klopoff said. So, gang warfare, natural disasters, a plague, and famine have decimated the nation, but the government is going to waste time looking for religious people who are hiding in the mountains. These are some interesting priorities the government has. Of course, they're really Chad's priorities, or rather, his fears about others' priorities. He's certain that the persecution of Mormons that existed in the past still exists today. Everybody's out to get LDS people. The government, the UN, Russia, China. So in his head, this plotline makes sense. Klopoff shows Garrett the list, and he immediately finds Nathan on it. Denise and Carol aren't on it, for some reason, even though they were both listed as fugitives in the last book. Klopoff asks Garrett if anyone he knows is on the list, and he says, yeah, my kid from my first marriage. He's a Mormon. And Klopoff says Garrett should have disowned him. Obviously, the only explanation for Nathan being on a list is persecution of the Mormons. He's literally done nothing illegal other than tying that chip compliance officer up with a vacuum cleaner cord for like 3 minutes. No, I take it back. Trying to bind a man with a vacuum cleaner cord does warrant death. Thus ends Chapter 6. The next morning, Nathan and Marie leave the Heber Valley camp on four-wheelers, which they ride to the Heber City flood zone. From there, they walk toward Heber, or through Heber, or maybe around. Chad is very vague. "This is eerie," Marie said. "It was one thing to see massive destruction in the Midwest, but this is Heber." Nathan and Marie walked for a few miles toward Provo Canyon. The stench of decay and death was everywhere, and Marie gagged several times. She didn't complain, though, and Nathan appreciated her determination. Thank goodness Marie has stopped whining. They walk all the way to the north end of the Deer Creek Reservoir. Now, previously, it took them 5 days to get from the Walsburg camp to the Heber Valley camp, but somehow they've gone all this way in 1 day, so Carol must have really been slowing them down. The next day, they find a canoe and use it to ride the muddy, debris-clogged floodwaters down to Orem, then take 800 north into town, walk down toward Marie's house, and end up spending the night at the Orem Public Library, which Chad incorrectly calls the Orem City Library. And I have no idea why we needed this much detail about the route they took, but that's the end of Chapter 7. The UN convoy arrives in Orem, and the next morning, Garrett gets permission to drive over to his old house and see if Denise is there. She isn't. He notices that many sentimental items are missing from her room, though, and deduces that she must have moved in with the Shaws, because he's now psychic. I wasn't even aware he knew the Shaws. He goes over to the Shaw's house and finds evidence that Denise was living in Marie's room, but that's it. He returns to the convoy. Thus ends Chapter 8. Nathan and Marie walk to her house and see a UN Jeep outside. Chad doesn't capitalize Jeep. They don't realize Garrett is the one using the Jeep, though, and instead they hide from him until he leaves. Then they go into Marie's house, and Marie visits her old bedroom. "Wow, my life sure has changed," she said softly. She sat on the bed and sobbed, letting out months of pent-up emotions. Nathan had been checking other rooms in the house, and he rushed to her side when he heard her cries. "What happened?" he asked. "Are you okay?" She reached out to him, and he sat down beside her. She motioned toward a framed photo collage from her days at the University of Utah and a poster she had bought at a Taylor Swift concert in 2015. "These things mean nothing now," Marie said as she wiped her eyes. "These are tears of gratitude. I've got my priorities back in order, and I'm married to the greatest man in the world. I've been blessed." Yeah, that's why you're sitting in your old bedroom sobbing. I feel confident that Chad would have rated Taylor Swift at least a 4.2 dark. Nathan and Marie searched the house for food, because apparently they didn't bring any along when they left the Heber Valley camp. Then noticed the UN convoy traveling toward Salt Lake. Nathan immediately deduces that they're heading for the NSA data center, because he is also now psychic. Thus ends Chapter 9. Garrett advises General Klopoff to surround the NSA data center with their 5-axle transporters so that none of the employees can escape. The last time we saw the NSA employees, though, they weren't being allowed in because the earthquake had damaged several buildings and one was on fire. The employees, desperate for Band-Aids and Tylenol, overpowered and wiped out the armed guards. The UN troops are surprised to find no guards on duty. They knock on a door to a building and are let in by an employee who says they haven't received any instructions for days, so they're just hanging out and monitoring things. Klopoff orders all the employees to gather in the main conference room. When one questions the UN's right to access the NSA's data, Klopoff gives a signal, and one of the UN guys takes him out. The other employees shriek and fall in line. Garrett had watched the whole scene in semi-shock. He was surprised time and again by Klopoff's ruthless techniques. His mind returned to the shooting of innocent citizens at the Casablanca Casino in Mesquite. He felt sickened that his fellow peacekeepers continually resorted to violence to keep the people under control. During the next hour, Klopoff essentially reorganized the NSA employees and explained that their role now boiled down to finding American citizens via their implanted microchips. Let me know if that's not how you pronounce Mesquite. I didn't feel like looking it up. I think this is one of those situations where Chad's characters are doing things that make no sense, but his ideas are so distorted that he doesn't notice. Chad is a deeply controlling person. He wants to control others. And because he has no imagination and thinks everyone is just like him, he assumes everyone else wants to control others. Not just bad guys, either. The prophet, the church, Jesus, Nathan. What's always at stake in his stories is control. That's why he values obedience so intensely. After whipping the NSA staff into shape, Klopov takes a phone call from a leader in the Kremlin. Exactly why he and the man in the Kremlin are speaking English, I can't say. It's probably so that Garrett can eavesdrop on them. "We have secured the NSA data center in Salt Lake City," Klopov said. "The U.S. government's data is now under our control. I'm confident the coalition invasion can begin without interference." Garrett felt weak in the knees and leaned against the transporter as Klopov continued his conversation. He knew that America had barely endured the troubles that had already happened. The citizens weren't prepared for what was coming next. Thus ends Chapter 10. Unexpectedly, we jump into the point of view of Carol, Marie's mother and Aaron's wife, who's back in the nice white camp in Heber Valley. One afternoon, Carol went into the forest to collect fallen limbs when she saw a woman dressed in white standing several yards up the hill. She stepped back in surprise as the woman glided down the slope toward her and said, "Carol, don't be afraid. It's me, Helen Foster." Carol shook her head, amazed that Nathan's deceased mother now stood before her. "Helen, you look so good." Helen smiled. "Yes, the last time you saw me, I was a bit shriveled up because of the cancer." I can't believe Chad wrote this. I don't know if this is supposed to be self-deprecating humor on Helen's part, or if Chad thought that any ghost in her right mind would actually say this in a serious way. But it's tacky, pretty much no matter what his thought process was. Carol then says, "Wow, I guess we're in-laws now," and they blather about how special Nathan and Marie are and how great their wedding was, and I just can't believe that an entire page passes before either of them addresses the fact that Helen is dead. Finally, Helen brings it up. "I'm here on a special assignment. I have a dear friend in spirit prison who wants to enter paradise. She wants to assist her family on Earth. We need you to perform the temple ordinances in her behalf." "That should be possible," Carol said. "Yesterday they showed me the camp's tent temple. Who is your friend? Do I know her?" "Vanessa Foster." Carol was momentarily speechless, and Helen merely smiled as Carol digested that information. Carol finally spoke. "So you're saying that you've become good friends with the woman who destroyed your marriage and ruined your life?" "Yes, that is what has happened. Helen is a very forgiving person, apparently. She adds that a bunch of Vanessa's ancestors in spirit prison have also accepted the gospel and want their temple work done too." Carol promises to get right on it, then finds Elder Clough and says, "You're probably going to think I'm crazy, but I just had a visit in the woods from one of my deceased neighbors, Helen Foster. She wants some temple work done for several people." Elder Clough shrugged slightly. "I don't think you're crazy. It has been happening here a few times a week." I think Chad was trying to rip off an idea from Visions of Glory here, and he didn't do a great job. There's an idea in Visions of Glory that the people are slowly being translated and evolving spiritually, and the veil gets thinner as the earth prepares to change from telestial to terrestrial, and everybody starts gradually developing psychic powers. But if there's one thing Chad's writing lacks, it's finesse, so it just comes out of nowhere in his story. Carol goes to the camp's temple, which is a giant canvas tent that somehow has electricity, and the ghost of Helen reappears. She's holding a big book full of people's genealogical records, and Carol looks at it and enters the information into a computer. This only takes about 20 minutes, but afterward, Carol collapses. Elder Clough comes to her aid and explains, "Our mortal bodies just aren't designed to handle that much glory for so long. We have another room where you can rest and get your strength back." They guided her to a room with a nice bed and comfortable blankets. She sat on the edge of the bed and then lay down. They pulled a blanket over her, and she quickly drifted off to sleep, completely sapped, but with a huge grin on her face. This writing is so hammy. Huge grin just doesn't invoke reverence, you know? Also, to be clear, apparently the glory to which she was exposed was coming from Helen. The obvious question is, why write this plotline? Why include this? Just because Chad likes writing character conversions? I don't think it's that simple. As some of you have probably guessed, Chad wanted to send a message about Catholicism, and I think that's why he included this storyline. Now, my understanding is that for the first 100 years after the restoration of the gospel, the LDS Church's relationship with the Catholic Church wasn't much different than its relationship with other religions. There are obviously theological differences between the two, and they both seem to look down on each other, but coexisted without a great deal of friction. This was in spite of the fact that the Book of Mormon refers to the Catholic Church as the Lady of the Night of Babylon. Frankly, it's been called worse. Then, in 1958, came the publication of a book that included the line, "The Roman Catholic Church is specially singled out, set apart, described, and designated as being most abominable above all other churches." Under the index listing for the Catholic Church was the instruction, "See Church of the Devil." And who wrote this book with these incendiary lines? None other than one of Chad's heroes, Bruce R. McConkie, in a book that purported to be the complete LDS doctrine. David O. McKay was president at the time, and he was reportedly quite angry over what McConkie had written, not just regarding Catholicism, but regarding all kinds of things. McConkie hadn't checked with the church at all before writing this book. McKay went so far as to ask him not to reprint it. Anyway, my point is that I suspect Chad's loathing for Catholicism was inspired by McConkie, and he included this storyline as a little dig. Hilariously, it doesn't hold a candle to what ex-Catholics say about Catholicism. I also think there's an element of scorned first wife's revenge here. The idea that Helen got back at Vanessa by proving herself right religiously. By converting, Vanessa would have had to accept that Helen and Garrett's marriage was celestial and eternal, and her own marriage to Garrett was just an extended affair, and their child born out of wedlock. I think it's safe to say Chad intended to give Helen the last laugh. Thus ends chapter 11. Aaron and Elder Smith have spent the last 2 days walking from Temple Square in Salt Lake to the Bountiful Temple, which Google says should only take 4 hours. I decided to try to track the characters' movements more closely in this video because I thought it might reveal something interesting, but so far all it's revealed is that Chad doesn't know how long it takes to walk between places. He's completely inconsistent. When they were within a few blocks of the temple, they heard a whirring sound. They stopped and looked at the sky. Suddenly a black helicopter came over the ridge they had just been on. Aaron was partly in the road, while Elder Smith was standing near some bushes. "Hide," Aaron hissed to Elder Smith. "I'll take care of things." This is such a small thing, but it's infuriating. 2 men are walking somewhere together. They're friends. They stop to look at the sky. Are they standing near each other or not? They're standing near each other, obviously. But Chad wants them to be far enough apart that Aaron will be seen by the people in the helicopter and Elder Smith won't. And for some reason, he couldn't be bothered to come up with an actual reason why they wouldn't be standing near each other. A U.S. soldier jumps out of the helicopter, points a weapon at Aaron's chest, and tells him to get in. So apparently all the U.S. soldiers weren't overseas fighting other people's wars. Aaron climbs aboard and gets thrown in the back with the other prisoners, and the soldiers demand to know why he doesn't have the chip. He tells them he cut it out. The soldiers looked at each other in surprise. "This guy's crazy," the second soldier said. "Let me shoot him, and we can toss him out the side door." "Calm down," the first one said. "Shooting him now would just make a mess. If he's telling the truth, maybe we'll get some brownie points from the commander for bringing him in." Aaron bowed his head, grateful to be spared. Then the first soldier kicked him in the ribs, making Aaron gasp in pain. The soldiers laughed before moving to the front of the helicopter. A captured man near Aaron whispered, "This sure doesn't feel like America anymore, does it?" Aaron shook his head. Everything has been turned upside down. Satan must be celebrating. Yes, Satan got an ice cream cake on his way home. I'm not sure why Chad suddenly decided to make the U.S. Armed Forces complicit. This is the only scene in the first 3 volumes of this series in which they even appear. Back on the ground, Elder Smith says a prayer for Aaron and then books it to the Bountiful Temple. I guess he doesn't think anyone there can help Aaron because he doesn't mention him and instead asks after his wife. Nobody's heard from her. Thus ends chapter 12. So, I just got a migraine. It's not very bad, so I'm going to keep recording mostly because this is what I had planned for tonight. But I did turn off most of the lights, and now this looks like a hostage video. Finally, an appropriate visual mood in which to talk about Chad's work. Anyway, I will stop recording if I feel terrible, so don't worry about that. Where was I? Nathan and Marie have spent all day following the UN convoy north. Not on purpose, they just happen to be going in the same direction. The convoy finally turns off to go to the NSA data center, which happened in chapter 10. Chad isn't presenting things in chronological order. Now, I'm not saying you can't present a story out of order. Christopher Nolan has made an entire career out of it. But I think the reason Chad is doing it is just sloppiness. He figured most people wouldn't notice, and probably most didn't, which doesn't make it okay. Nathan and Marie have spent all day walking and have now reached Point of the Mountain. Marie is wiped out, but Nathan doesn't want to sleep in the open, so they pray about it, and God tells them to go to the Draper Temple. There's an issue, though. A very large issue. Here's the most logical walking route from Point of the Mountain to the Draper Temple. And here's the approximate boundary of the Salt Lake City sinkhole that Chad wrote about back in the last book. He says the sinkhole extends from Sandy to Bluffdale. Now, maybe I'm wrong about how far into Bluffdale it extends. Chad isn't exactly specific, so maybe it's more like this, or maybe it's not as circular as I'm imagining. But personally, I wouldn't want to go anywhere near this thing, because you know the edges are unstable. They walk 2 hours to get to the Draper Temple, and Nathan, who is now frantic to check in, asks the people at the temple to let him use their computer and the Zoom network to talk to his boss. In seconds, they've got Elder Miller pulled up on FaceTime, or whatever it is. Nathan tells him that he successfully rescued his good friend from Chicago, and Elder Miller says, "That's great, because I need you to take on an important assignment. You might want to take your friend along as well." Nathan shifted the laptop so Elder Miller could see Marie, who was sitting next to him. "I'm glad to hear that, because my good friend is now my wife." The look on Elder Miller's face was priceless, but he kept his composure as Nathan and Marie smiled back at him. "Wife?" he's asked. "Please explain how that happened." Ha ha ha. Chad's sense of humor is just awful. Nathan tells him they got sealed in the Nauvoo Temple, which isn't really what Elder Miller was asking him about, but that doesn't matter. "That is wonderful," Elder Miller said. "The Spirit is confirming to me that it is the Lord's will. Not that I can do much about it." They all laughed, and then Elder Miller grew more serious. You can pretty much break any rule as long as the Spirit confirms it's okay. Part of the reason these books don't work is the way Chad uses the Spirit. Instead of reserving the Spirit for important, meaningful occasions, Chad uses it to push minor plot points, so it loses any mystery and beauty and starts to feel more like some kind of office manager. Here's an example. Elder Miller says, "You must get to the Bountiful Temple as soon as possible. It won't be easy, but stick to the foothills." Marie looked like she was going to cry. "Elder Miller, I'm so worn out. I don't know if I can make it. Could I stay here for a while? Elder Miller looked thoughtful. No, the Spirit says otherwise. I feel you need to stay with Nathan. This just doesn't inspire faith. It doesn't leave me with a feeling of awe or wonder. Instead, it makes me think, why doesn't God care that Marie is exhausted? I guess the Spirit decided to compromise on that subject because it declares that Nathan and Marie can take four-wheelers to make the journey easier. Everyone in Utah owns a four-wheeler. Nathan asks Elder Miller why they're so urgently needed at the Bountiful Temple, but Elder Miller won't tell him. It's another terrible attempt to build tension. Thus ends Chapter 13. Garrett is now in Copperton, Utah, where the UN has decided to establish their headquarters. Why isn't clear. What they're doing in Utah isn't clear. At this point, we might as well drop the pretext of the invasion of the US and just say that the UN is here to kill Mormons. That's what Chad really wants to write, a worldwide war against the LDS Church and its members. To that end, the UN is rounding up earthquake survivors and putting the troublemakers and people with debt in outdoor holding pens, which Chad writes were built during the era of martial law. Which is confusing because, as far as his readers know, martial law is still in place. No one ever said it ended. But now that it's over, they've added concentration camps in the form of giant pits in the ground. They basically just throw the prisoners into the pits and let them fend for themselves. Then Chad does something that, if any other writer did it, I would be shocked, but it's certainly something Chad has done before. He plagiarizes himself. He takes 3 paragraphs from one of the Standing in Holy Places books, I don't recall which one, and pastes them in here. I'm not going to bother reading them because I'm pretty sure I read them the first time, but they're basically just paragraphs describing how the Mormons are left to die. Chad throws in a new paragraph in the middle with more details about how cruelly they're treated. This kind of word-for-word plagiarism just isn't something I usually see writers do. Garrett has been put in charge of evaluating new prisoners. Unfortunately, very few of the prisoners had skills that the coalition needed. The new society needed blue-collar workers, such as farmers and plumbers, to get everything running again, but such citizens seemed to be in short supply. Instead, Garrett and his fellow UN officers saw a steady stream of bankers, lawyers, computer technicians, and administrative assistants. Many of them were still wearing the same clothes they had on when the earthquake hit. The UN sorting procedure was the same as it had been in Long Beach. There were 2 options. A person who didn't fit the coalition's needs was taken to the left and put on a bus, which would then take them straight to the copper mine's pit of death. A page ago, Chad said the camps were just for troublemakers. Now it's anyone who isn't a blue-collar worker? What is the logic of that? It's strange that Chad seems to be making a dig at anyone who's white-collar, given that he spent half his career as a white-collar worker. He sold printer toner and worked at a newspaper and ran a small publishing house. Then we get a brief scene to let us know what Garrett's job is like. And I'm going to read the entire thing because it's so nuts. The day dragged on, and Garrett's patience was growing thin as one lady proudly spouted off about the upper-level class on human behavior she had taught at the local community college. Garrett held up his hand. "Ma'am, are you a Mormon?" "I am." "Then why are you here?" Garrett asked. "What do you mean?" "Didn't your prophet tell you to go to the mountains a few months ago?" Well, I had my job at the college that I couldn't give up. Plus, I didn't want to lose my 401k. "How did that work out for you?" he asked. She shrugged. "Not bad, I guess, until now." Garrett tilted his head and gave her a half grin. "It seems to me the proper human behavior would have been to follow your religious leader." "Maybe, but I didn't want to go hide someplace," she said. "I wanted to still make a difference in the world." "So you think you can contribute to our new society?" Garrett asked. Absolutely, she said, staring into his eyes. Garrett nodded slowly. Okay, you've convinced me. Please go take a seat on the bus. Thank you, she gushed. You won't regret it. As she hurried off to the bus, Garrett's partner nudged him with his elbow and said, Well done. Who is Garrett to judge this woman for not gathering to the mountains? He was excommunicated. He's out. Someone in the comments called Garrett the prodigal Mormon, and that's clearly what he is. Obviously, he's going to repent and get rebaptized, but why? That's the question I keep coming back to. Why is it that Garrett gets to repent and return, and all these other people don't? All those people in the white camps who've been abandoned by God, and they aren't bad people. They're just people who took a few days to decide to go to the mountains. But Garrett, who didn't keep the commandments, cheated on his wife, got excommunicated, and made no effort to return to the church, has been singled out by God to be humbled and returned and forgiven. Why? I don't know. Thus ends chapter 14. Nathan and Marie have spent 2 days riding a four-wheeler toward Bountiful. Now, Google says this is a drive that should only take an hour, even if you divert around the giant sinkhole, but I guess they had to go into the foothills to avoid destruction and angry survivors. They're riding along on the third day when Marie gets a text message from God that says to stop and listen. She makes Nathan stop, and they get off their four-wheeler. They waited in silence for a few moments. Marie could only hear the chirping of a few birds, but then faintly came a voice from a wooded area below them. "Hello? Can you hear me?" a woman cried. "Help me!" That voice was much sillier than the one I was intending to use. All right, well, that's her voice now. They follow the voice and discover an elderly woman trapped under the fallen roof of a picnic pavilion. She's been there since the earthquake and only survived because she had a bottle of water on her, which, I don't know. The earthquake was more than a week ago, so it must have been a pretty big bottle of water. Anyway, Marie and Nathan are excited to discover that this old lady is Elder Smith's wife. Now, Nathan has managed to save the lives of both Elder Smith and his wife, and she's very impressed. They pop her onto the four-wheeler, and the three of them ride the last hour to the Bountiful Temple, where Sister Smith is reunited with her husband. It turns out that the vital errand Nathan and Marie have been given, this secret errand that they couldn't even know about until they reached Bountiful, is accompanying the Smiths to Rexburg. That's it. I don't want to say it's a bummer, but it's a bummer. Thus ends chapter 15. The prophet makes a speech that's broadcast over the church's satellite network. The entire purpose of the speech seems to be to tell everyone in the camps that they were right. He's not announcing anything or introducing anything. It's just a pep talk for the smug and self-righteous. Each of you who are listening to my voice have been put through many trials over the past few months, yet you have stayed faithful. In order to create a Zion people, the Lord has put us through a sifting process. We all have friends and even family members who were considered active members of the church just a year ago, but who are no longer a part of us. For whatever reason, they have chosen a different path. For what reason? Whatever reason. Afterward, everyone in the Heber Valley camp is happy. "Why is everyone crying?" Denise asked. "I feel very happy." "Well, that's the reason," Carol said. "We're happy to hear the prophet of the Lord tell us we're on the right track. We are getting closer to becoming a Zion people." This speech was the entire purpose of this chapter. It was just a chance for Chad to remind us about the importance of obedience. Thus ends chapter 16. The UN has taken over the LDS church in Copperton to use as their headquarters, and in the evening, everybody sits in the chapel and watches projected footage of the coalition invasion of America, which began that day. Garrett tried to block out of his mind how wrong it was for the UN soldiers to be tromping through the church building. It was just another aspect of daily life where everything had been turned upside down and God had been forgotten. Chad mentions repeatedly how upset Garrett is that the church is being used by the UN. It honestly feels like he's more perturbed by that than by the genocide in which he's participating. Garrett is disgusted by the invasion footage and goes outside for some air. He walked a few more steps, then fell face first on the grass. "Heavenly Father, please help me escape from this awful situation," Garrett prayed. "I can't take it anymore. I'm surrounded by barbarians. I'd rather die than endure much more of this." He lay there for several minutes in the dark, and then a warmth filled his chest and he heard the word, "Soon." Garrett looked up, but no one was around, but he audibly heard, "Soon," once again. "Thank thee, Heavenly Father," Garrett cried. "I will be patient." This is a slightly better interaction with the spirit than the last. I'll give Chad that much. Although I still don't understand why Garrett is redeemable and no one else is. The next day, he's sorting prisoners and feeling irritated by a guy who won't shut up about his MLM, which is probably the most relatable experience Chad has ever written. Garrett gives it to him straight. Garrett shook his head. "I've got news for you. America was invaded yesterday by foreign armies. Your life will never be the same. They'll be here in Utah within days." The man looked shocked. "That can't be right. God will protect this land." "I'm sorry, but America turned away from God. Please go get on the bus." Remember, the people on the bus get executed. He moves on to the next prisoner. "You don't have a chip," Garrett said. "I could order your immediate death. Hey, look at me when I speak to you." Aaron looked up, and Garrett knew those eyes. He involuntarily recoiled as a tangible shock passed through him. Aaron Shaw? Was it possible? He and Aaron don't acknowledge that they know each other, which I wasn't aware they did. But Garrett sends him to the outdoor pen instead of putting him on the bus. The more I think about this, the more it bothers me. Nathan lost touch with his father when he was 8, and he didn't meet Marie until high school. So when and how did Garrett and Aaron meet? Thus ends chapter 17. Although Chad doesn't make it clear, the narrative jumps back in time again to follow Nathan and Marie as they make practical decisions about how to get the elderly Elder Smith and his wife to Rexburg. Unsurprisingly, they decide to take four-wheelers. Chad is really into four-wheelers. When they stop to camp the first night, Elder Smith decides it's time, and he tells Marie how her father was captured by the UN. There was an awkward silence. Then Elder Smith added, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier, but I felt it might have caused you to stay behind and search for him. I have prayed night and day that he will be protected." Marie wiped tears from her eyes. "It's okay. You're right. I probably would have tried to save him." Nathan put his arms around her. "Thank you for telling us. It's a relief to finally hear what had happened to him." It's a relief? It's a relief to learn that your father-in-law was captured by a genocidal enemy? This is one of those moments when a character does something simply awful and nobody calls him out. Elder Smith has been flat out selfish. He didn't tell Marie what happened to her father because he wanted her to take him to Rexburg. Why is it so important that Nathan and Marie be the ones to take them to Rexburg? Why couldn't someone else go and let Marie try to save her father? No one ever calls Elder Smith out because he's the authority. Instead, they thank him. Thus ends chapter 18. Garrett again sneaks out of the evening show of destruction and chats with Aaron, who's in one of the outdoor holding pens. He says he'll try to get Aaron out, then goes to an empty room and thanks God for connecting him with Aaron. Thus ends chapter 19. At this point, I have no idea how the timelines are lining up for different characters. I think that Nathan and Marie are about 4 days behind the rest of the characters, but it's pretty confusing. Even worse, I'm not sure why Chad doesn't have everybody on the same timeline. It seems like he only wants to follow one group in each chapter, which is fine. I usually do the same thing. But given that many of his chapters are only 3 pages long, I don't see why he couldn't have broken up the chapters differently, in a way that would allow all the characters to pass time at approximately the same rate. Anyway, Nathan and Marie strap Elder Smith and Sister Smith onto their 4-wheelers and drive up to North Ogden. Then a maintenance missionary takes them to boat to Brigham City, and then he drives them in a truck to the Logan Temple. Thus ends chapter 20. General Klopoff has decided to move his operation to Salt Lake soon, because the waters are retreating. He wants to occupy Temple Square as a symbolic gesture, because this is really all about the Mormons and has nothing to do with America. Garrett decides he better bust Aaron out tonight, but he's having doubts. Garrett lay down on his cot, but he couldn't stop shaking. It felt like he was having a panic attack. Doubts kept creeping into his head. Life with the UN isn't so bad, he told himself. And who cares about Aaron? Yes, we are friends, but is it worth giving up everything I have worked for just to set him free? Then Garrett thinks about Denise and Nathan and decides to bust Aaron out after all. He reminded himself that none of this other stuff mattered at all. Even if he somehow rose to great prominence in the coalition, it would never fill the void of being separated from his family. He knew Aaron was the key to seeing them again. How is Aaron the key to seeing his kids again? If he wanted to abandon the UN and go find his kids, he could have done that months ago. Also, wasn't he just separated from his son Nathan for 14 years? He springs out of bed, grabs the key to the Jeep, lowercase j, and a pair of bolt cutters, and heads over to the end of the enclosure pen farthest from the guard. It appears there's a single guard for the entire pen. Also, when he starts cutting through the fence, Aaron is the only prisoner who notices and wanders over. He jumps through the big hole Garrett cuts, and they run to the Jeep together. Garrett opens the jockey box, a piece of regional slang with which I was unfamiliar before reading this book, but which just means glove box, pulls out a first aid kit, and tells Aaron to cut out his chip. Personally, if I were running from the coalition, I would have been driving with one hand while Aaron cut the chip out of the other. But they instead decide to wait, and Aaron even takes the time to apply a band-aid before they get moving. Aaron and Garrett drive a mile and decide they're in the clear. Thus ends chapter 21. We jump to the point of view of General Klopoff, who's pretty ticked off when dawn comes and the one guard discovers that all of the prisoners have escaped in the night. That's right. No one noticed until dawn that all the prisoners were gone. General Klopoff quickly discovers that Garrett is missing, and so is the red Jeep, which is all the more remarkable because all UN vehicles are white. For reasons unknown, Garrett and Aaron have spent the night driving east. I don't know where they're going, and I'm not convinced they do either. Eventually, the Jeep runs out of gas and they abandon it on the side of the highway. They break into a house and eat some snacks, not sure where those came from, and then go to sleep on the couches, whatever that means. But General Klopoff is hot on their tails. "Where are you going, my delusional American friend?" Klopoff asked. "You'll never get away with this." Chad says a whole lot of things about the general's men using a helicopter to follow them and them leaving all these obvious tracks and everything, but basically what it comes down to is that because Garrett and Aaron left their bright red Jeep on the side of the highway and barely walked 5 minutes before breaking into a house, it doesn't take the general's men long to locate them using a heat detector. Garrett and Aaron are awakened by the sound of a helicopter. General Klopoff has arrived! Garrett tells Aaron, "Go hide in the basement. They might not even know you're with me." "They'll kill you," Aaron said. "We could run out the back door and get away." Garrett shook his head. Maybe this is the way it's supposed to end for me, but one of us needs to survive." The two men embraced briefly. Then Aaron turned and descended the basement stairway. Seems like the wrong moment for a hug, given the time crunch, but what do I know? Garrett runs outside with his hands up and tries to blame his actions on job stress. "Commander, I'm sorry. I lost my head. The pressure of leading the group into downtown Salt Lake got to me, and I freaked out." "I don't believe you," Klopoff said. "I should never have trusted an American." Klopoff raised his hand, and the soldier fired 3 quick shots into Garrett's chest. Garrett winced in pain and looked down to see a rapidly widening circle of blood soak his shirt. He fell to his knees and cried out in agony. Then he fell face first onto the concrete driveway. The soldier approached Garrett and turned him over with his boot. It was clear he was dead. "Leave him," Klopoff said. "We have no use for his body. Let the animals eat him." I know General Klopoff is supposed to be a bad guy, but I do like his style. He takes his men and leaves, and Aaron eventually departs the basement and finds Garrett's corpse on the driveway. He's sitting on the ground sobbing when he hears a voice. "Check the shed." The voice startled Aaron, especially since he was sitting next to a dead body. He even lifted the blanket to check if Garrett had spoken, but he clearly hadn't. If Chad meant this to be funny, I think it was misplaced in what is otherwise supposed to be a sad but spiritually uplifting scene. If he didn't mean it to be funny, then it serves no other purpose. Either way, it should have been cut. Aaron checks the shed and finds a full gas can, so he pours the gas into the Jeep. Then he wraps Garrett up in a blanket and puts him in the Jeep, too. Not sure what his thinking is there. He starts driving. Apparently, they were heading to the White Camp in Camas, presumably because Aaron thinks Carol is there. But before he can even run out of gas, a blizzard moves in. He pulls the Jeep over and prays to God to send someone to rescue him. Thus ends chapter 22. Meanwhile, or possibly days earlier, Carol can't sleep. She decides to go to the tent temple, even though it's past 9 at night. She goes to the celestial room, which surprised me because for a canvas tent, it sure has a lot of rooms. And the spirit of Helen Foster appears to her. She says, "There has been a tragedy. Your husband Aaron is stuck in the snow on the highway west of where the Jordanelle Reservoir was. If someone doesn't reach him by morning, he will pass away." Carol is obviously upset by this news, and she's about to run to Elder Clough when Helen stops her. "There's one other thing," Helen said. "The rescuers need to take a sled and a body bag with them. Farewell for now." Way to leave them wanting more, Helen. Elder Clough says they have a snowmobile for emergencies, and of course this counts. So he'll send Paul and his son Jake out at dawn, which, Helen said Aaron would be dead by morning, so I feel like that's too late to even be worth bothering with. But that's the call they made. Carol, at the advanced age of 45, is too old and feeble to accompany them, but thanks them instead. "I'm so grateful for you," Carol said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Oh, I almost forgot. Helen said to take along a sled and a body bag. She didn't explain why." The men were silent for a moment, but Paul said, "We'll make sure we do." Thus ends chapter 23. Aaron, still in the Jeep, is slowly freezing to death. He's run out of gas, and he doesn't have a coat. And for some reason, it hasn't dawned on him that there's a blanket in the Jeep, and the corpse it's wrapped around has nothing to fear from the cold. Honestly, one of the most infuriating lapses in logic in all of Chad's writing. Although, this almost beat it. Aaron decides he needs to move around to warm up, so he gets out of the Jeep. A gust of icy wind went up his shirt, and it shocked his already fragile system. He dropped to his knees, unable to stand any longer. The snow looked like a fluffy blanket that he could just curl up in and take a long nap. Chad has used the word blanket 3 times in 3 paragraphs, but he never puts 3 and 3 together. Aaron is still kneeling in the snow when Jake and Paul arrive on their snowmobiles. "He's suffering from hypothermia," Paul said. "See if there are any blankets in the Jeep." Jake went to the Jeep and grabbed the blanket in the back seat, but it seemed stuck. He tugged a bit more, and Garrett's head emerged. "Ew," Jake said, jumping back. Dad, we've got a problem here. There's a body in the back of this Jeep." "That's my friend Garrett," Aaron said sleepily. "He got shot." Yeah, he did. Did Chad seriously decide not to have Aaron use the blanket because he thought it would be funnier if Jake discovered Garrett's body? I'm half surprised he didn't decide to do a whole Tauntaun thing. We know Chad loves Star Wars. Also, this is completely unrelated, but Chad revealed for the first time in this scene that Aaron has a beard, and it completely threw me. Never in 3 books have I imagined him with a beard. I didn't think Chad approved of beards. Jake and Paul, whom I'm struggling not to call Jake Paul, take Aaron to the Heber Valley camp, where he's reunited with Carol. Just then, Elder Clough joined them. "I heard the snowmobiles return," he said. "I hope there's some good news." "There is," Carol said. "This is my husband, Aaron. He needs a good shave, but he's doing all right." Well, now I'm really confused. I guess he just grew the beard in the last 8 or possibly 12 days since the earthquake? Elder Clough is also confused by the body bag on the sled because he thought they needed it for something other than transporting a body, I guess. And then even more confused when he learns Garrett Foster is the body inside. Elder Clough shook his head, then looked up at the sky. "This doesn't make any sense. Last night I had a vivid dream of Nathan and his dad helping the church fight for freedom against the invading forces. I've never met Garrett, but I'm certain it was him." Okay. And you're apparently certain that it was a vision of the future, which also seems like a jump to me. I'm sure you can see where this is going. I'm sure you could see it as soon as Helen told Carol to send a body bag along. Frankly, I was surprised Aaron didn't do this himself after his success in Dale's flooded basement. Then he and Garrett could have been cuddle buddies and survived the cold together. But instead, he lets Elder Clough do the honors. Elder Clough simply nodded, then knelt at the end of the body bag and unzipped it about a foot. He looked at the others and said, "Pray in your hearts for a miracle." He then stuck his hands into the bag and located Garrett's head. He then proclaimed in a loud voice, "Garrett Foster, in the name of the Savior Jesus Christ and by the authority and power of the Melchizedek priesthood, I command your spirit to re-enter your physical body and be made whole." Elder Clough got to his feet and watched the bag intently. So did everyone else. Carol gasped as she spotted the bag start to shift slightly. Then a muffled voice came from the bag. "Get me out of here!" Knock, knock, knock. Once again, a tepid joke derails what should be a powerful and inspiring scene. They've just witnessed a miracle. But there's no sense of awe or wonder, or as Chad would say, wonderment. He's very fond of the word wonderment. I hate it. Garrett is happy to be alive again. Garrett's eyes got misty. "Thank you so much. I was given a life review while in the spirit world, and it was terrible. I have failed in so many ways. I'll be a better man now." Yeah, dude, you participated in genocide. What were you expecting from your life review? He says he has learned some things in the spirit world that he needs to share. They wake Denise up, and if she has feelings about the fact that her father died and was resurrected, we don't get to hear about them. Instead, Chad writes that scene again, where everyone gathers around and listens to someone recount all their adventures. As part of this, Garrett says, "The reason I decided to leave the UN was because my new assignment was to conquer downtown Salt Lake. I just couldn't do it. I decided I would rather die than do so." So he was comfortable helping the coalition wipe out thousands of innocent people, but he had moral qualms about helping them occupy buildings? Garrett really has expressed more upset about Klopoff using the temple as a movie theater than he has about the people he sent to the pits. He's unequivocally the worst person among the major characters in this book, and yet he just got resurrected. I still can't figure out why he gets a pass when far better people don't. He finally gets around to explaining what happened after he died. "I was greeted by two lovely women. My first wife, Helen, and also Denise's mother, Vanessa. That was kind of scary in itself. I think they wanted to tease me and give me a rough time, but they are such good people that they couldn't do it. They admitted they are now very close friends. Helen is an angel in so many ways." Yeah, this issue of second marriages seems to be a bit thorny in an LDS context, especially the way Chad sees it. I mean, obviously Garrett's going to get rebaptized. So does that mean that he has to go back to his first wife when he dies? How does he feel about that? This reminds me of a story about something the Catholic Church did, and I really love this story, so I'm going to pause to talk about medieval impotence. In medieval England, impotence was considered to have one of two causes: God and witchcraft. If God caused it, then it was natural, permanent, and an acceptable reason for a divorce. If it was caused by witchcraft, though, it was reversible, and therefore not a justification for divorce. There is a case recorded in medieval English law in which a man and woman were granted a divorce because he was impotent and it was ruled natural. However, a few years later, his neighbor turned him in for having knocked up his mistress. The court said, "Well, you aren't impotent now. We must have been wrong, and this must have been caused by witchcraft. And for that reason, we're undoing your divorce, and you have to go back to your first wife," whom, by that time, was married to someone else and had a baby on the way with him. Sadly, the records don't tell us how all this played out. I suspect it would have made a great Reddit post. But back to Garrett's account of the spirit world. Garrett says that he pleaded to be allowed to return to his life and fix things, and somehow Helen made it happen. I don't really know how that works. According to Chasing Paradise, she would have needed permission from the foster family council, so maybe she got that somehow. He says he was shown that Nathan and Marie are on their way to Rexburg, and God wants the rest of them to follow. Carol points out that's going to be pretty tough with all the snow. Thus ends chapter 24. Nathan and Marie are still at the Logan temple with the Smiths, and somehow their timeline has caught up to the one everyone else is on. I guess they spent 4 days at the Logan temple. Their plan to get to Rexburg involves avoiding certain areas where there's been trouble. So they're going to go east to Bear Lake and up to Star Valley, Wyoming. From there, they'll go to Rigby, Idaho, and then on to Rexburg. The entire trip looks like this. The church has provided them with a truck, 4-wheel drive no less, and is going to send a snowplow ahead of them. Where are they getting the gas for all these vehicles? Chad says that the oil embargo caused the country to fall apart, but when his characters need fuel, there's always some miraculously squirreled away. They spend the day very slowly driving to Afton, Wyoming through huge drifts of snow, but the stress begins to get to Marie. Nathan was driving, and he was being very cautious, but more than once the truck started sliding toward the edge of the road where a steep drop-off awaited them. Marie was sure the right front tire had actually left the road. "Hey, you're gonna get us killed!" she shouted at Nathan. "Keep your eyes on the road!" "I'm doing my best," Nathan responded. "Sorry." The same thing happened a couple more times, though, and each time Marie snapped at him to be more careful. The Smiths had tried to keep the conversation light after each of Marie's outbursts, But finally everyone settled into silence as Marie fought within herself to avoid a complete emotional breakdown. She had been through many trials during the past year, but the stress of the past few hours ranked right up there with anything else she had experienced. This is surprisingly relatable. I think we've all felt anxious and rattled during a harrowing car ride in bad weather, and most of us have been trapped in a car with a bickering couple. That's not the most emotionally comfortable experience, but Chad writes this like Marie's behavior is outrageous. He offers her no grace. I'm gonna have to do my old lady voice again here. All right. Marie could tell something wasn't right with her body. When the truck pulled to a stop in Afton, she leaped out and promptly threw up. Sister Smith gently took her by the arm to help her. "Let's see if there's a doctor in the church," she said. "I'm fine," Marie said. "Just give me some breathing room." Nathan and Sister Smith exchanged puzzled glances. "She just puked. Give her a minute." Now we've jumped from Marie being stressed out and that being socially unacceptable to Marie vomiting and needing a doctor. Because if you're grumpy or short-tempered, there must be something physically or spiritually wrong with you. Also, did they just drive into this town and go to the church? Aren't the cities all full of murderous gangs and the churches attended by disobedient apostates who don't take communion? And why would there be a doctor in the church? Well, there is. Marie explained to Dr. Taylor how she was feeling, and Nathan couldn't resist chiming in about her actions. "Nathan, shut up," Marie muttered, and the doctor tried to keep a straight face. I just thought that part was funny. Dr. Taylor examines Marie and pronounces his diagnosis. "You already know what it is, because I complained in a previous video that there's only one reason women vomit in books or on TV. Dr. Taylor said. "Well, this should be curable in a few months." "Oh no, I don't want to be sick that long," Marie said, shaking her head. "Do I have mono?" "No. Even better. You're pregnant." Nathan felt like he'd been slapped across the face. Nathan didn't know where babies came from. I don't know why he's surprised. All cranky, vomiting women are pregnant. That's facts. They stay overnight at the church, and they start driving again the next day. Another blizzard hits, though, and they can't go any farther. Then a squadron of 10 snowmobiles appears, sent by whomever is in charge in Rigby, and they've even brought appropriate winter gear. Everybody hops on the snowmobiles and rides into the blizzard. Thus ends chapter 26. After transferring to a snowcat in Rigby, the Smiths and the Fosters arrive in Rexburg at the BYU Idaho campus. Chad spends an entire page just letting Marie marvel at how nice it is, and having Nathan feed her information, which is another moment of entrenched sexism, is my opinion. I don't think he's ever been to the BYU Idaho campus before, so why is he lecturing her on how and why it was built? How does he even know these things? They settle in and are offered a chance to video chat with their families. This is done over Zoom. Not the Zoom we're used to, it's a Zoom Chad made up, and it stands for Zion Official Online Membership, or something like that. I'm sure that he claims that the Zoom we're all used to, though, is like the product of his prophecy. I'm just telling you that off the top of my head. My head is not hurting, but my meds are making me a little loopy. Nathan is shocked to hear how his father was raised from the dead, but doesn't actually express any happiness at seeing his living father. Marie is happy to tell Carol that she's pregnant, and Carol's all, "Oh, that's wonderful." Afterward, Elder Smith tells Nathan that he needs Aaron and Garrett in Rexburg to help him organize a defense against the coalition. It seems like Zoom meetings are the way to go. Given that an earthquake and flooding has destroyed the interstate system, society has descended into chaos, and there are coalition soldiers sweeping the area, but Elder Smith insists that Aaron and Garrett need to come to Rexburg. He decides to fly them there, and everybody thinks that's unlikely to work because the UN has taken over the local Air Force base and is shooting down planes. But they send some guys out with the snowplow to clean off the airport runway. Also, Nathan has decided he can't handle pregnant Marie. Nathan tapped him on the shoulder. "Can we have Carol and Denise come too? Marie could really use the support." Elder Smith nodded and turned back to the screen. "Did you hear that? Send the whole family." Yeah, Marie needed the support. Thus ends chapter 26. They find some pilot named Mike to fly an 8-person Cessna to the Heber Valley camp. Obviously, the camp has no runway, so he's going to have to land at the Heber City airport, and everybody from the camp hikes down to the airport to clean the frozen flood debris and 2 feet of snow off the runway. Sounds like a piece of cake. "Just to double check, you really feel we can pull this off?" Mike asked Elder Smith. "I do. The Lord's hand will guide you." "I sure hope so," Mike said. "I haven't flown without lights in a long time." The apostle gave a small grin. "Trust your instruments and you'll be fine." Okay. It sounds like even if Mike is instrument rated, he hasn't flown while relying on instruments in a minute. For those of you who don't have flying experience or a partner who loves planes, flying a plane during the day when you can see where you're going is much easier than flying at night when you have to rely on instruments to tell you which direction you're going and how close to the ground you are. I don't know why, but I keep picturing Mike as Swamp Thing from Con Air. Mike and Nathan take off, and Mike immediately brings up how nervous he is. Also, why is Nathan going with him? Doesn't he have a pregnant wife sleeping in a student center who would probably like his company? Nathan mentions that he can't see Logan out the window, and given that it's nighttime and that most of the area seems to have lost power, I'm not sure why he would be able to see Logan, but he expresses concern about it, and Mike tells him that God is hiding Logan from sight, but it will become visible if he prays to see it. Nathan does, and Logan briefly appears, and he's like, "That's a pretty neat trick." However, there's a problem. Within minutes, the instruments showed they were above Park City, but everything felt strange. They couldn't see a thing other than the faint outline of Mount Timpanogos to the right. "I feel we're too low," Mike said. "The instruments seem wrong." Just then they saw a campfire on a hill above them. "Whoa, we're in trouble," Mike said. "Trust in the Lord," Nathan said. "Take your hands off the controls." "No way," Mike said. "Are you nuts? Do it or we're going to die." Mike closed his eyes and lifted his hands. The plane suddenly swerved upward to the left, and they could feel a multitude of treetops scraping the bottom of the plane. Once the plane leveled out, Mike put his hands back on the controls. "Well done, pilot," Nathan said softly. I guess Jesus really is their co-pilot. They land, and Nathan is reunited with his father, sister, and in-laws. Chad writes that Nathan and Garrett hug, but that's all he says about their reunion. Frankly, given that Nathan thought Garrett was dead and Garrett was briefly dead, I thought there would be more emotion expressed. But instead, Chad wrote this. I'm gonna call Jake and Paul, Jake Paul. Then things got emotional for another minute as everyone bid farewell to the 3 men who would be staying behind. Aaron started crying as he grasped Jake Paul by the arm. Time and again, you and Jake Paul have rescued our family, he said. We'll never forget you. So being reunited with family members you thought were dead is less emotionally compelling than saying goodbye to Elder Clough and the guys who operate the camp's 4-wheelers? That's wild. I don't even know if I can call that a writing error. It's more like an emotional error. Like, Chad was simply incorrect about how people are likely to behave. In fact, now that I think about it, Chad often places more emotional emphasis on saying goodbye than reunions. That's curious. Also, I don't think that Jake Paul giving Carol a ride to camp when she was less than an hour's walk away and just really tired counts as saving her life. So I don't know what Aaron's talking about. This leads to another unforced error. Mike, Nathan, Garrett, Carol, and Aaron, and Denise, fly back to Rexburg, only to learn that Marie wasn't feeling well and decided to go stay with an uncle of hers who lives in Rexburg. Nathan and her parents drive up there, using what gas? I don't know. And the house has a porch light, and the uncle living there seems to be fine. Did society not collapse in Rexburg? Has the famine not reached Idaho? Because of the potatoes? I know Chad wanted to present Rexburg as a city of refuge so that he could convince all his cult members to move there, but we need some kind of explanation for why nothing there seems to have changed. Because Chad wants it that way isn't good enough. Marie is reunited with her parents for the first time since the first book in this series, and her father has the good grace to apologize. He said, "I need to apologize for trying to stop you from taking that internship in Chicago." "What do you mean?" Marie asked. Aaron shrugged. "When you left, we were sure it was going to be a disaster." Marie tilted her head. "Well, wasn't it?" "Not at all. I'd say it was a success. Because of that internship, you're happily married in the temple and have a baby on the way. That's all your mom and I ever wanted." And that brings us to our final visit with the Marie as Tad checklist. There was an earthquake in this story, but Marie wasn't in it, and she never hid out at her in-laws' house. So I don't think her story and Tad's are perfect mirrors, but they did have some very close similarities, especially in this all-important plot point. Marie never does anything important in this story again. And that's just how her parents and her husband like it. Thus ends chapter 27. We're basically going to skip chapter 28 because only two things of note happen. First, Garrett announces he wants to get rebaptized, and gosh, that really comes out of left field. Chad would have been smart to foreshadow that. Second, everybody is called to the BYU Idaho Center to listen to the prophet while he makes a speech. If you've actually watched this and the other 11 videos I've done on Chad's adult fiction, you could probably write this speech yourself at this point. They're wrong, we're right, Jesus loves us most, building a Zion people, etc. Thus ends chapter 28. All the characters are called to a meeting with Elder Smith, who passes out new assignments. Aaron is now in charge of monitoring the coalition via the NSA's computer system. If they've already managed to hack the NSA, I feel like they probably don't need the assistance of a data analyst, but whatever. At least Aaron's being given a job that has something to do with his previous life. Unlike Nathan, Elder Smith tells him, "You and your father are going to help prepare the elders of Israel to defend their liberty." Nathan was surprised. "I'm not a soldier." "No, but you're a natural leader, and the men will follow your example. Throughout the winter, we'll be organizing and training the men in the camps to go to war against the coalition and save our country." Nathan is a delivery truck driver. Before that, he was a stock boy at Toys R Us who quit in the middle of his shift. The closest he's ever come to a leadership position is when he led that woman and her family from Temple Square to the Wallsburg camp, and I seem to recall that she wasn't super pleased with him the next time they ran into each other. This isn't the first time Chad has had one character tell another that they're a natural leader when the statement is unjustified. I recall that being said to Josh Brown at least a couple of times. This makes me think that Chad thinks of himself as a natural leader. I don't know to what extent cult leadership skills will translate to other types of leadership, personally. Garrett at least used to be in the army and has spent time with the coalition, so it makes somewhat more sense that he'll be whipping the LDS troops into shape. As for Marie, Denise, and Carol's assignment, oops. When I said all the characters were given new assignments, you didn't think I meant the women, did you? This conversation is interrupted by Aaron, who announces that the coalition forces are heading south on I-15 from Montana. After looking at a map, I thought the concern was that they were headed for Salt Lake. But then Chad clarifies that the concern is that the coalition will go south to Idaho Falls, turn northeast on US 20, and come to Rexburg. But if the coalition wanted to come to Rexburg, why wouldn't it take Idaho 33 and save itself a lot of time? And don't say because the road is too small for the 5-axled vehicles. I checked. I went to Google Earth. They could get across that. Garrett asks if they have any troops in Idaho Falls. No. They don't have any troops anywhere. All they have are a bunch of very smug doomsday preppers, half of whom aren't allowed to help with anything other than cooking and childcare because they're women. Get me to Idaho Falls, Garrett said. I can talk to them. Surely you aren't going alone, Elder Smith said. No, I need some muscle behind me to look authentic. I will create a UN uniform for myself, but everyone else can be dressed in US Army gear. Garrett can't make a UN uniform? That would require sewing, and he lives in a society with a diamond-hard gender binary. The next morning, Garrett, Nathan, and a number of others are waiting on the highway in Idaho Falls. Chad never says how many others or where they found army uniforms or how it is that they're fully armed. Garrett had spent the morning putting the finishing touches on his UN uniform and helmet. It wasn't perfect, but he hoped it would do the job. I'm imagining him in janitor's coveralls with a soup tureen on his head. Oh, and this. He had rigged a white pillowcase to a pole, and he now held it above him, allowing it to flap in the wind. You know how long it would take to cut and sew an actual white flag? Like 20 minutes, and that's if you bother to hem it. Not only do these soldiers look like extras from a Pauly Shore film about summer camp hijinks, their training is at about the same level. Nathan had never actually fired a semi-automatic rifle. What have they been doing for the last 24 hours? The bare minimum? Finally, the coalition convoy arrives. Garrett waves his white pillowcase, declares that he's with the UN, and says he's in charge here. The coalition leader gets out of his truck and questions Garrett, who drops General Klopoff's name. After that, everybody trusts him. They even laugh about how much he looks like that American traitor, and then show him a video of himself getting shot in the chest. Garrett laughs and says, "Yeah, that guy could be my brother." And no one finds this at all strange. He tells his fake soldiers to let the coalition through, and they all go home. In case it wasn't clear, this appears to have been the climax of this book. Thus ends chapter 29. The last chapter of the book is all about how the prophet was so inspired by Garrett's success that he decided to give a speech. What a novel idea. And he lets Garrett open for him. Garrett spoke first, and he had everyone on the edge of their seats with his rousing account of facing the leader of the coalition convoy. He closed by saying, "I assure you that they can be defeated. They are simply mortal men like us. They have big machines, but we have the Lord on our side. The power of men cannot match the power of God. You are the Lord's modern-day warriors. I salute you." Rousing account. He made small talk with them for 2 minutes. Also, I'm not sure how confident I feel in taking advice about how to defeat the enemy from a guy who's already been killed once by the enemy. Then the prophet speaks, from his wheelchair, because he's very old, about physical fitness. He then outlined a physical fitness regimen that each man would be required to participate in. If you discover that you just can't do it, particularly the older men, we will find other ways for you to serve. But I urge each of you to get into the best shape of your life. We will outperform the enemy in every way. If we are physically superior, we are much more likely to prevail. This isn't an MMA fight, buddy. The primary weapons involved here will be be sidearms. And because Chad still thinks this is a clever idea, swords. But I don't hear anything about training in those areas. The entire preparation the prophet recommends consists of getting pumped and receiving a temple endowment. The prophet also decides that Garrett can be rebaptized, so... The following Sunday, a crowd of about 20 people gathered around the small pond on Mark's property. A hose attached to the well had been running steadily into the pond ever since they had returned from the meeting in Rexburg, and now the pond glistened with pure spring water. I have so many questions. Why are they running a hose into the pond? Is it a pond or is it a puddle? How deep does a body of water need to be in order to fully submerge a man? 18 inches? Why didn't the pond freeze? And does Chad think that well water is pure spring water? Am I missing something? Nathan baptizes Garrett. It's not exciting or spiritual or satisfying in any way. Afterward, there are some predictably bad jokes. Nathan, that's pretty impressive, Aaron said as he helped them out of the water. You baptized your father and your sister in the same year. And both times the water was freezing cold, Nathan said playfully. Then we get to hear about the women for the first time in 4 chapters. After the men had changed clothes, everyone gathered inside the house for the confirmation. Then the women got busy dishing up a delicious meal with plenty of desserts. Aaron spotted Garrett piling his plate high and then adding a piece of chocolate cake on the side. Hey, soldier, Aaron said harshly. Aren't you going to watch your diet? Garrett gave him a wink. Training doesn't start until next week. Yeah, that's what we get to hear about the women. Finally, Chad decides to throw in a mini cliffhanger at the end. This is regarding Nathan. He vowed to cherish this brief time with his family in Rexburg. It was a miracle that they were all together, but deep down he knew it was only temporary. He sensed there were people in that room who would soon give their lives for the gospel. It hurt to contemplate, but he knew it would be for the glory of God. I'm ready, Lord, he thought. Bring it on. I don't think I have ever, not once in my life, uttered the phrase, bring it on, during a prayer. What does it mean to tell God to bring it on? Is that a challenge? Is he challenging God to smite him? Because what Nathan is talking about is people dying. And the strangest part of all of this is that this upcoming battle for which they're all going to get into the best shape of their lives is the so-called Battle of Denver, which Chad covered in Standing in Holy Places, which is how we know that no one dies. One guy gets shot in the upper arm and he's fine. But I'm guessing that Chad, in his unending quest to prove that death doesn't matter, so he has nothing to fear from it, is going to change that. Thus ends chapter 30. The last section of the book is titled Preparing for Battle. It gives a rundown of how all the major characters spent the following winter. Garrett spearheaded an extensive training program for the elders of Israel. His training program was so effective that it was videotaped and shared with LDS stakes all over the world, just like David's plans for how to convert golf carts into hand carts. In addition to helping Garrett, Nathan and Marie were assigned by Elder Smith to a committee that created a new daily gospel curriculum for all families. It focused on the words of the prophets in the last days and on preparing for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And the curriculum was made up entirely of Roger K. Young books. This is another example of Chad promoting the teaching of end times prophecies, although I don't know how Nathan and Marie are qualified to teach such a thing. Carol and Denise were fully occupied in helping keep everyone fed and clothed. One entire building on the BYU Idaho campus was devoted to cloth making. It's a sweatshop, isn't it? And Aaron sits around monitoring the coalition. Thus ends Days of Fury. So, How could we have made this book better? And what have we learned about Chad by reading it? Regarding how to make it better, very little actually happens in this book. Marie finds out she's pregnant. Denise gets baptized. Carol talks to Helen's ghost and does some proxy ordinances. None of it's very exciting or interesting, not even the part with the ghost. Those parts, at least, could easily have been perked up. Part of why Chad's plot lines always fall flat is that there's never any struggle or complication. This plotline can be summarized as Helen asks Carol for a favor, Carol readily agrees, Carol performs the favor. Chad never develops the storyline. Even in Garrett's storyline, which is the one in this book where the most things happen, there isn't a lot of development. When he rescues Aaron, it's incredibly straightforward. He cuts the fence and they get in a Jeep and drive off. Aside from Garrett's storyline, most of this book is just people traveling from one place to another. It's logistics. Endless logistics. And logistics aren't super compelling. Good stories tend to have two layers, two storylines. There's a technical storyline and an emotional storyline. In Titanic, the technical story is about the sinking of the ship, and the emotional storyline is about Kate Winslet falling in love and taking control of her own destiny. In Gladiator, the technical storyline is about a soldier trying to take control of Rome back from a deranged emperor, and the emotional storyline is about a man longing to be reunited with his family after losing them. In good stories, the technical and emotional storylines move together in lockstep all the way through to the end. The boat sinks and the boy drowns. Titanic sort of reveled in being a tragedy, although Kate Winslet finally got to do her own thing, so I think viewers felt okay about it. I don't really know, I hated that movie. But in Gladiator, the two storylines definitely reached a climax at the same moment, and it worked. Chad rarely manages to work in any kind of emotional storyline. He got a bit of one going with the Nathan and Marie love story, but that storyline basically ended halfway through the last book. There's no conflict or tension between them in this book, other than that single chapter in which she snaps at him and then discovers she's pregnant. That hardly counts as a plot line. The rest of their screen time is taken up with traveling. They travel here, they travel there, they're given a mystery assignment, and it turns out to be more traveling. Neither of them change as people. Denise learns about the church and gets baptized, which ought to be an emotional plotline, but because we've never really gotten to know Denise, and she never talks about having a spiritual life before her conversion, it rings pretty hollow. If she's different in some way afterward, we don't hear about that. Carol seems entirely unchanged by her interactions with the ghost of Helen, and Aaron seems entirely unchanged by anything except facial hair growth, and that is neither a technical nor an emotional plotline. Chad seems to believe that once you're living in accordance with God's plan, you're happy no matter what. That is an incredibly simplistic take, and it makes for boring writing. Years ago, I was friends with a writer who was a hardcore pacifist, so hardcore that she wanted to write stories without conflict. And after a few years of trying, she told me she had realized it was possible, but it wasn't possible to both eliminate conflict and write stories interesting enough that people wanted to read them. For whatever reason, human beings seem to be hardwired for conflict. We want to see things go wrong and then get fixed. We want to see desires realized and needs fulfilled. Sometimes we want to see things go wrong and people fail to fix them. But 5 out of 6 characters in this story lack needs, desires, or conflicts. So where's the payoff for the reader? There is also the huge issue of showing versus telling. So much of this could have been told instead of shown. I know the usual writing advice suggests showing instead of telling, but as I've said before, there has to be a balance that takes into account the nature of the events being discussed. We didn't need to hear the details of Nathan and Marie traveling back to Orem and wandering around and sleeping in the library. You've probably already forgotten that happened, haven't you? Here's my advice to writers. Summarize the boring parts. Describe the interesting parts. Trying to construct a novel entirely of interesting parts also is a bad idea. Novels are too long for a reader to sustain that kind of emotional tension. Readers need to get worked up and then come down for a bit. There's a rhythm there, like breathing. It's okay to let your readers relax a bit during a nice summary of what would otherwise be a very dull trip down a flooded canyon. Moving on to Chad himself. I don't know what this book told us about him. That he's more interested in logistics than people? That despite his entire worldview being dominated by Utah Valley, he doesn't have a great sense of Utah's geography or how long it would take to get between places there using various types of conveyances? I was watching the new documentary on the Scott Peterson case, and there was an interview with a criminal profiler who worked on his case, and she said that one of the surprising things about Scott Peterson was how short-sighted he is. He really thought that everyone would give up looking for Lacey and Connor after a few weeks. And I immediately thought of Chad and Lori. Everybody asks how they thought they were going to get away with all of this. I think they were just as short-sighted as Scott Peterson. I think they believed that everyone would forget about JJ and Tylee after a few weeks. Like they didn't have other family members who cared or something. They just can't see very far ahead. I don't know if that's psychological or neurological or cultural or what exactly, but Chad does the same things in his stories. When he does give his characters real conflicts, he gives them exactly one, and it always ends with them coming to Jesus, and that's that. He had enough conflict between Nathan and Marie, and also between Marie and her parents, for the first book in this series, and no more. It was the same with Emma and Tad in Standing in Holy Places. It makes me wonder why he writes series instead of standalone books. He's much better suited to one-offs. Next time, I'll be discussing Chad's final novel, Reclaiming Liberty. And I'd say something intriguing about it, but I haven't read it. I decided to save that one and read it right at the end, so next week will be a surprise to all of us. I'm mentioning this because I want to say something about Garrett and why Chad considers him redeemable, but I'm not sure why that is yet. I'm hoping I'll find the answers in Reclaiming Liberty. My best bet at this point is that Chad was already cheating on Tammy when he wrote those books, and he wanted to include a character who was a cheater but got redeemed. However, I think that writing that storyline would require some inspiration in the form of guilt, and I've never seen any evidence that Chad can feel guilt. Maybe he understands it intellectually well enough to write the story. I'm hoping the final book will provide some clarity on this matter. Finally, this book is yet another example of Chad's books predicting his life in a strange, almost eerie way. Chad wrote a story about a cheater who got excommunicated. Chad became a cheater who got excommunicated. Chad wrote about a man who got married a second time. Chad got married a second time. Chad wrote about a man who did terrible things, died, and had to face his first wife and accept that she was an angel in many ways. Chad did terrible things, and he's going to die and have to face his first wife and accept that she's an angel in many ways. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it, and I know other creators would appreciate a little extra love right now too. The YouTube algorithm seems to be getting tweaked, and everyone's impressions have dropped like 50%. There's a lot of panic in chat rooms for creators right now. So we could all use a little extra support and encouragement if you feel so inclined. As a reminder, please don't reach out to anyone involved in this case, and remember to use your words wisely. Thanks. People who were active members of the church just a few months ago are now dead because... They're all dead.